When you walk to a library and check out W in the philosophy section, you're going to find numerous books by Ludwig Wittgenstein as the author. And here you can see the University of Helsinki library section on Wittgenstein. But in reality, Wittgenstein only wrote one book or published one book during his lifetime, namely the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, the 100th anniversary we are now actually celebrating. A tiny red book that you can also see there. And in addition to that, he prepared for publication what is known as the first part of the philosophical investigations. But that was it. So where did the rest of the books come from? Basically, they came from material like this, from so-called Wittgenstein's Nachlass. He'd been writing throughout his philosophical career and left behind some 20,000 pages of typescripts and manuscripts. And in his will, he had appointed 3 of his students, Elisabeth Anscombe, Russ Rees, and Georg Henrik von Wright, to serve as his literary executors and to publish what and how they saw fit. So the volumes that we find on those library shelves are the outcome of the gradual process of the editorial work that the 3 literary executors eventually launched. But given the nature of the material, given the nature of Wittgenstein's Nachlass, for instance, Wittgenstein's repetitions and reworking of his own text, the editors did not publish the material as they found it, but rather they organized and rearranged that material into books. Now, none of them were professional editors, but instead they were philosophers in their own right, having their own understandings of the content and goals of Wittgenstein's philosophy. So one has good reason to wonder whether these understandings actually had an influence on the outcome. And today I'm going to talk about a case where I do see an influence. This case pertains to the much loved collection Culture and Value of Vermischte Bemerkungen, edited by Georg Henrik von Wright. So in his foreword to the 1977 edition of Vermischte Bemerkungen, Georg Henrik von Wright writes as follows. In the manuscript material left by Wittgenstein, there are numerous notes which do not belong directly with his philosophical works, although they are scattered among the philosophical texts. Now, Vermischte Bemerkungen, or Culture and Value, the English edition published in 1980, is a selection of such notes, collected and arranged by von Wright from Wittgenstein's manuscripts and labeled by him as aphorisms. Themes that fall under this allegedly less philosophical category of remarks include culture, religion, and the arts. And while von Wright readily acknowledges the difficulty of separating such notes from Wittgenstein's manuscript material, he is nonetheless committed as an editor of Wittgenstein's Nachlass, as well as in his own work, to a distinction between philosophy proper and remarks on subjects of a more general sort, such as questions about art or about religion. Now, this starting point reflects the ethos of mainstream analytic philosophy that standardly takes the arts and aesthetics to have little, if any, relevance for problems of such core areas of philosophy as metaphysics, epistemology, or logic. In the Anglo-American setting, philosophy is typically seen as compartmentalized into more or less well-defined pockets that deal with their own specific issues and topics. And aesthetics, namely the field of philosophy that is perhaps most closely related to arts and culture, is treated as the relatively narrow investigation of art, beauty, and taste. So in this way, aesthetics is pushed to the outer limits of philosophy, not seen as interestingly connected with the hard core of philosophy, let alone capable of making a philosophical contribution to that core on its own terms. In my view, this very conception of philosophy in general and aesthetics in particular has played a significant role in the reception of Wittgenstein's work, including the way in which the literary executors approached Wittgenstein's Nachlass. The reception of Wittgenstein's work against the analytic conception of philosophy and the resulting way in which Wittgenstein's Nachlass has been made available to readers has a long shadow. An illustrative example of the reception of Wittgenstein's remarks on aesthetics and the arts is Severin Schröder's paper, Wittgenstein on Aesthetics, published in the 2017 Blackwell Companion to Wittgenstein as the only entry on Wittgenstein on Aesthetics in that volume. Schröder writes in summary of his paper as follows. One of the points that will, I hope, emerge from the following presentation is that the lack of sustained work on philosophical aesthetics in Wittgenstein's writing is not entirely accidental. For on his view, aesthetic issues are not susceptible of an abstract philosophical treatment. They belong to art criticism rather than philosophy. And what is more, their discussion can only be addressed to an audience sharing a specific cultured taste. This, by the way, is very close to the way in which von Wright saw Wittgenstein's remarks on the arts.
Hanne, I am sorry to interrupt you. We do not seem to see the whole slide. Do you think you could try to make it a bit smaller in size so that it fit the screen? Sorry about that.
Dear. No, thank you for telling me, but that's bad. I have no idea on how to do that.
Just try to make the presentation. Yes, now it's okay. So it might have been only the 2 slides. No, it's fine. Yeah, it works fine.
Are you sure? So now you can see what Schröder says?
Yes.
Good. So I think Schröder is right to claim that we don't find a sustained work on philosophical aesthetics in Wittgenstein's Nachlass. If by this we mean a treatise or Wittgenstein's work in general, if by this we mean a treatise on the ontology of arts, say, or a systematic argument on the nature of artistic expression or principles of tastes. I also agree with his diagnosis that this is no accident. However, in my reading, the reason is not that Wittgenstein believed that aesthetic issues do not belong to philosophy, as suggested by Schröder. After all, already in the Tractatus, logic and ethics, which Wittgenstein famously equates with aesthetics, are suggested to stand on a par, as indicated by Wittgenstein's way of characterizing both as transcendental. In his later work, in turn, Wittgenstein compares work on philosophy to work in aesthetics and refers to aesthetic investigation as grammatical, a term marking his preferred method of his later period. So in my reading, the main reason for the lack of sustained treatment of aesthetic issues in Wittgenstein's corpus is that Wittgenstein's own understanding of aesthetics does not correspond to the Anglo-American mainstream conception of the field. The very fact, noted with surprise by von Wright, that Wittgenstein's remarks on aesthetics and the arts surface intermittently in his writing and in the context of other topics, reflects an understanding of aesthetics as intimately interconnected with philosophy in general. For Wittgenstein, aesthetic issues are not issues that could be neatly isolated from questions that he's primarily concerned with, such as the constitution of meaning, the nature of linguistic understanding, or the nature of normativity, as one might expect if reading his work from the perspective informed exclusively by the Anglophone tradition. For Wittgenstein's work is not simply the fruit of early analytic philosophy. As pointed out by several commentators, Wittgenstein's work has deep roots also in the German tradition of thought and in Kant's philosophy in particular. Moreover, by contrast to the analytic tradition, aesthetics and the arts, perhaps music especially, have a much more prominent role in those philosophical traditions that originate in the work of Alexander Baumgarten and Immanuel Kant, who adopted Baumgarten's seminal idea that logic and aesthetics are two mutually complementing ways of approaching reality. In the Kantian tradition, aesthetics is understood broadly as the investigation of the domain of sensibility, which is required for the possibility of conceptually determined cognition and manifests itself distinctly in non-conceptual judgments, the pure judgments of taste. So while aesthetics in this broad sense incorporates the study of art, genius, aesthetic judgments, and the possibility of their justification, all themes that figure in Wittgenstein's remarks published in Culture and Value, it also plays a significant role in, for example, Kant's discussion on how to apply a conceptual rule to a sensible particular, as well as in his treatment of human agency. So in the following, I will argue that Wittgenstein ought to be read as belonging to the German tradition with respect to his approach to aesthetics and the arts. This is to say that Wittgenstein's remarks on music and the other arts are not simply mere illustrations of an otherwise independent philosophical account, but are rather intended to contribute to problems at the very core of philosophy, and do so specifically by revealing the limitations of discursive thought. So what I'll do in the following is to outline the way in which Wittgenstein himself treats music and the arts in those texts that he himself prepared for publication. The first set of examples I'm going to show you is from the Tractatus, and the second from the first part of the Philosophical Investigations. And after going over these two sets of examples, I'll conclude by comparing them with an example drawn from the edited collection Culture and Value. So let's start with the Tractatus. It is a question debated in the community of Wittgenstein scholars whether there is a hard core in the Tractatus in Wittgenstein's early work, insofar as such a hard core is understood as an attempt to provide a philosophical account as an answer to a specifically philosophical question. But if there is such an account, then this account concerns the nature of linguistic sense. This account, sometimes labeled the picture theory of meaning, treats propositions as pictures of possible states of affairs. According to this theory, the sense of a proposition rests on two conditions. First, as a picture, the proposition must have something in common with the reality it depicts. This common essence of propositions and possible states of affairs, Wittgenstein argues, is logical form, which Wittgenstein actually claims to be the form of reality itself. Second, the proposition must have elements that as constituents of that proposition refer to the elements of the depicted state of affairs, namely objects. And it is clear from Wittgenstein's texts that not just the proposition as a whole, but also the constituents of the proposition, which he calls names, have logical forms. These correspond to the forms of objects for which the names stand as representatives. We can picture facts to ourselves, as Wittgenstein writes, precisely because the names are capable of combining together in the way in which the objects of the pictured state of affairs are imagined to be combined. Such combining is made possible by the forms of the elements. Form is the possibility of structure, as Wittgenstein writes. So in this way, logical form, as the form shared by language and reality, is the essential condition for the possibility of linguistic sense. Now, in explaining the key points of this theory, the picture theory of language, Wittgenstein appeals to music and does so repeatedly. So here is my exhibit A, excerpts from the Tractatus. So first, Wittgenstein appeals to music in his explication of the articulate character of propositions. According to the Tractatus, it is a central feature of propositions that they have structure. This is to say that in a proposition, names, that is the constituents of the proposition, stand in a determinate relation to one another, as Wittgenstein writes. So when he's explaining this undeniably central idea of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein writes, a proposition is not a blend of words. A proposition is articulate. But an integral part of this explanation, if one given in brackets, is Wittgenstein's following remark. Just as a theme in music is not a blend of notes. So what are we supposed to bring home from this further remark that evokes the idea of a musical theme as an articulate structure? Here is a proposal that will take us to the second point of contact between the picture theory of language and music, namely the character of the Tractarian objects, the objects that are the elements of states of affairs, and elements of reality in the sense that Wittgenstein says that they are the substance of the world. As said, the essence of the object lies in their ability to combine together in virtue of their logical forms to form states of affairs or facts. In a similar way, the notes of a scale are essentially capable of combining to form a musical theme. And to be sure, in the beginning of the Tractatus, when explaining what he means by the notion of an object, Wittgenstein points out that notes must have some pitch. Just like it's impossible to imagine a note without some pitch, and hence a potential role in a melody or in an interval or in a chord, it is impossible to imagine an object, a Tractarian object, independently of its possibilities of combining with other objects. And this is a crucial point of the Tractarian ontology, that objects are such that they can combine together. And I would claim that the weight of Wittgenstein's comparison between an object and a note should not be underestimated, given that otherwise Wittgenstein refuses to give any examples of objects that he claims to be the substance of the world. There are no other examples besides the reference to notes, along with reference to specks in a visual field and objects of sense of touch. These are the only concrete illustrations of the Tractarian objects that then complement in the book the abstract requirements that objects must satisfy, like their simplicity, unalterability, and subsistence. And notice that all these examples that Wittgenstein gives are from the realm of aesthetics, as understood in the broad Kantian sense of the term, as pertaining to the domain of sensibility. Now, this point is related to Wittgenstein's understanding of logic. Just like the Tractarian facts that belong to a logical space, so too the theme, the musical theme, belongs to a musical space. But we don't encounter such a musical space independently of the relations between the notes themselves. And this I take to be the point of Wittgenstein's remark. As suggested by the opening remarks of the Tractatus, we come to contact with logical space by encountering the world as already structured. The world as I found it, as Wittgenstein calls it, is already a totality of facts. And as such, it is structured in accordance with the possibilities determined by logical form. The forms of facts that comprise the world are grounded in the forms of the objects, where these forms just mean the object's possibilities of combining with one another. So in this sense, as Wittgenstein writes, objects contain the possibility of all situations, but we encounter that world by encountering the facts. But underneath these facts are the objects as the substance of the world. And just as the object's possibilities of combination determine the possible relations with other objects in states of affairs, so too, we might say, in a given scale like D minor, A and D, the notes, stand to one another in the internal relation of the dominants and the tonic. Indeed, any interval or melody reflects the potential relations that obtain between the notes of the scale, that is, the different tonal functions determined by the relations between the notes. So what the appeal to notes that must have some pitch serves to underscore in my reading is that the application of names in a proposition is not prescribed from an external point of view of an ideal logical notation crafted by logicians, say. Instead, the constituents of the facts already carry with themselves their own principle of organization. And this, I would claim, is a key feature of Wittgenstein's philosophy of logic. Logic in the Tractatus is not a doctrine that is prescribed from without, but instead it deals with the form of reality and form of thought simultaneously as its constitutive principle. Okay, so that much about Wittgenstein's logic. But the third instance of Wittgenstein's appeal to music in the Tractatus pertains to his notion of the relation of depicting. And this, of course, is a key notion for the picture theory of language. The relation of depicting that holds between language and the world, holds between propositions and states of affairs. Wittgenstein talks about the essential connection between the two, brought about by the shared logical form, the logical form that reality and language share. And again, Wittgenstein's example is from the realm of music. He writes, a gramophone record, the musical idea, the written notes, and the sound waves all stand to one another in the same internal relation of depicting that holds between language and the world. They all have a common logical construction. And let me just point out that this notion of an internal relation in the Tractatus always indicates a connection to logical form. Internal relations are relations that couldn't fail to obtain because they are grounded in logical form. Now, the emphasis in this quotation is not on the demarcation between language and the world. It doesn't matter which phenomena listed here stand for propositions and which for non-linguistic states of affairs pictured by propositions. But what is relevant here is the essence of the pictorial character, namely the internal relations between the four musical phenomena determined by logical form. As indicated by the continuation of this remark, the point is rather that they all have a common logical construction. In other words, the formal unity of the sound waves, the score, the recording, and the musical idea reflects the formal unity that Wittgenstein envisions in the Tractatus to hold between language, thought, and reality. Undeniably a core assumption of Wittgenstein's early account. Now, the operative idea in the references to music in Wittgenstein's discussion here, in his discussion of the articulateness of the proposition, objects, and the essence of the pictorial character, is the Tractatus's distinction between form and content. Wittgenstein claims that the unalterable substance of the world, namely the objects, is form and content, where form just means the object's possibilities of combination. And the distinction between form and content applies equally to propositions. Propositions too have form and content. Now, according to the Tractatus, we find the purest instance of logical form in tautologies that do not have content. This is because tautologies don't determine any specific state of affairs as their empirical content. Indeed, Wittgenstein himself states that his fundamental idea is that logical constants are not representatives. There can be no representatives of the logic of facts. So it follows that propositions of logic are empty of empirical content. In other words, the propositions of logic are tautologies. They don't picture any empirical states of affairs, but they only show or display their own form. And yet, precisely as tautologies, abstracted away from any possible empirical content, the propositions of logic, Wittgenstein writes, show the formal logical properties of the world. And here, we could find a fourth instance of Wittgenstein's appeal to music. But now I'm cheating a bit, because the reference is not from the Tractatus, but from an earlier notebook entry from 1915. Wittgenstein writes, a tune, a musical tune that is a kind of tautology. It is complete in itself. It satisfies itself. So what Wittgenstein's remark implies is that the musical theme has the form of sense without the possibility of giving empirical content to that form. So again, we find music figuring as the model of logical form as reflected in tautologies. Again, a notion at the very center of Wittgenstein's early philosophy proper. What I'm suggesting then, dramatic as this may sound, is that logical form as the essence of the world is displayed not just in propositions of logic, but in music. This very idea of music, revealing the form of the world, figures in different variations time and again in German aesthetics. We find it in Kant's idea of absolute music as a paradigm example of free beauty that invites a pure judgment of formal purposiveness and warrants judgments of the purposiveness of nature in general. We find it in Schopenhauer's view that music is the immediate expression of the metaphysical will, which for him, for Schopenhauer, is the essence of reality. And we find it in Edward Hanslick's claim that in the tonally moving forms of music, we hear the formal features of the movement of the human mind as well as of the universe. And we find it in Adorno's notion of music disclosing the conditions of society. So while Wittgenstein's early account of the essence of the world is undoubtedly more formal in character than these other positions, perhaps with the exception of Kant, his way of connecting music to logical form may nonetheless be seen as a version of this idea pervading German aesthetics. So I'll now turn to Wittgenstein's later work as articulated in the first part of the philosophical investigations that he authorized for publication. If we look for a line of thought that belongs directly to the hardcore of Wittgenstein's philosophical work in his later period, then the most obvious candidate is Wittgenstein's discussion of rule following. What is at stake in this discussion is the possibility of applying a general rule, like add to a particular case required for understanding. What, if anything, justifies a particular application of a rule so that we talk about one's behavior as following a rule as opposed to being in mere conformity with the rule? It is standardly assumed that, according to Wittgenstein, it is not yet enough that my behavior conforms to the rule that is constitutive of the language game, providing the context of the use. If I understand, then my behavior ought to be internally related to the rule so that I can appeal to the conceptually formulated rule in explaining my application thereof, in explaining my application of add to in a mathematical series. But in doing so, by appealing to a conceptual formulation of the rule, I inevitably fall back on yet new interpretations of the rule. And here, the interpretation is understood as a conceptual formulation of the original rule. This is actually a line in Wittgenstein's, the famous section on rule following. He there claims that we ought to talk about interpretation only when we mean a conceptual formulation of the rule. This is section 201 in philosophical investigations. So usually in the literature, sections 185 to 242 of the investigations are treated as addressing the question of how the rule can determine its correct applications. But intriguingly, immediately before these sections, in section 184, Wittgenstein gives a musical version of the more well-known mathematical example of rule following. He writes, I hope you can see this, but I'm going to read it. I want to remember a tune, and it escapes me. Suddenly I say, now I know it, and I sing it. What was it like suddenly to know it? Surely it can't have occurred to me in its entirety in that moment. Perhaps you will say it's a particular feeling as if it were now there. But is it now there? Suppose I begin to sing it and get stuck. But may I not have been certain at that moment that I knew it? So in some sense, it was there after all. But in what sense? Perhaps you would say that the tune was there if, for example, someone sang it through or rehearsed it in his imagination from beginning to end. I'm not, of course, denying that the statement that the tune is there can also be given a quite different sense. For example, that I have a bit of paper on which it is written. And there you also have the bit of paper. So the challenge here in this paragraph is exactly like that of understanding the rule determining the series of natural numbers that Wittgenstein talks in section 143. What is required for a warranted claim to knowledge of the tune is an ability to take the step from the rule, that is whatever it is that gives identity to the tune, to its potentially infinitely many instances, namely performances of the tune. And also Wittgenstein's candidates for the criterion of knowing the tune mentioned here in this paragraph, a particular feeling, performance, a mental image, all these candidates go in tandem with the mathematical example that evokes similar phenomena as potential criteria for understanding a rule. But the musical example is such that it immediately creates obstacles to the route to an interpretation given by a rephrase or rule formulation. While a rule formulation may be given in the form of the bit of paper on which the tune is written, and I hide it in my pocket, hide in my pocket, its inability to bridge the gap between the rule and its application is blatantly clear. The written score does succeed in conveying some information about the abstract shape of the tune, but in comparison to a particular performance, it is but a skeleton made out of a flourishing body, to borrow Edward Hanslick's characterization of the difference between a performance of a musical piece and a technical analysis thereof. Besides, to know a tune involves having a hold of its internal purposive unity, the completeness of the tune that Wittgenstein identified as a key feature of a musical theme already in 1915. This insight about the completeness of musical forms emerges also in the philosophical investigations, where Wittgenstein asks, what happens when we learn to feel the ending of a church mode as an ending? Clearly, this feeling of closure is something that we can learn. But the challenge of justifying the aesthetic judgment, such as this is a complete musical thought, this is where the tune comes to an end, springing from that feeling, cannot be exclusively met by conceptual means. I can refer to a textbook on modal harmony or quote a rule formulation, or I can try to convey my judgment by means of comparisons, such as Wittgenstein's own example. It is as if a conclusion were drawn. But if my interlocutor does not experience the ending as an ending, the rule formulations, comparisons, or further descriptions will not resolve the matter. They don't force anyone to accept my judgment. So the correctness of the judgment, which I must acknowledge if I'm to know the tune, seems to hang in the air just as the next step to be taken in a mathematical series. The point is, as Wittgenstein repeatedly emphasizes, that we cannot appeal to new expressions of the rule without entering into an infinite regress. At some point, I cannot bring up any further interpretations of the rule I have applied, but I have to follow the rule blindly, without a conceptual justification. In my reading, it is precisely this point that is brought to the fore already in section 148 of the Philosophical Investigations, which evokes the puzzling phenomenon of knowing a musical tune. And to be sure, later in the text, Wittgenstein explicitly introduces two cases of understanding. The first, in which I can reformulate my judgment, provide the rule formulation, and the second, where I follow the rule blind. And here too, Wittgenstein connects the second sense of understanding to music. He writes, we speak of understanding a sentence in the same sense in which it can be, replaced by another which says the same, but also in the sense in which it cannot be replaced by any other, any more than one musical theme can be replaced by another. So now I slightly worry about the time. Should I skip a bit?
Well, I think we are still fine.
Okay.
Yeah. How much time do you need to have it complete?
10 minutes? Would it be okay?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. So the main point I want to bring home here is that the overall point of the musical example that we find already in the Tractatus carries over to Wittgenstein's later epitaph, surviving the many dramatic changes that otherwise occur in Wittgenstein's conception of language. True, in the investigations, there is no appeal to an immutable logical form given in the forms of the simple objects stated to be the substance of the word. Nor is there any commitment to a general propositional form that would underlie the conventions of everyday language. But in spite of these differences, there is something that closely resembles the view that we find in the Tractatus. This is the idea that once our conceptual resources have been exhausted, whether the Tractarian domain of meaningful propositions or Wittgenstein's later limited scope of justifications given by reference to conceptual formulations of the applied rule, the form of language shows itself. And both variants of this idea are conveyed to us by reference to the musical theme. So I'm going to skip something and move over, but I'm going to leave that omitted quotation there for you to see. So I'll conclude by bringing up one further example or what I read as a philosophically significant reference to music, but this time one that has ended up in that edited collection, Culture and Value. Recall the overall point that I've tried to make in discussing the role of music in the Tractatus and in the philosophical investigations. In both works, I argued, Wittgenstein connects the notion of a musical theme to the essence of language. In the Tractatus, this essence of language is logical form. In the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein writes that essence is expressed by grammar, by grammatical rules. Granted, in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein takes the logical form to be the form of every imaginable world, whereas in the investigations, grammar is tied to our historically developing and culturally variable practices. But still, the two notions are alike in one significant respect. By contrast to empirical statements that are contingent and debatable, logical form and rules of grammar alike have the status of being exempt from the demand of justification. This is because the possibilities of linguistic expression and indeed of phenomena rest on the status we assign to rules of grammar as necessities. And now, consider the following remark, drawn from manuscript 134 and published in Culture and Value. I'm going to call this the Mozart remark. And here is the Mozart remark. The necessity with which the second thought succeeds the first. Overture to Figaro. Nothing could be more idiotic than to say it is agreeable to hear one after the other. But the paradigm according to which all this is right is certainly obscure. It's the natural development. You gesture with your hand, would like to say, of course. One could also compare the transition with a transition, the entrance of a new character in a story, for example, or a poem. That is how this piece fits into the world of our thoughts and feelings. So even though the word necessity appears here in quotation marks, I would argue that the phenomenon at stake is the very same phenomenon Wittgenstein evokes in his discussion on rule following, namely the paradoxical moment of blind rule following, where I don't have a conceptual formulation ready at hand any longer. While the paradigm according to which the two musical thoughts naturally follow one another is obscure in that it cannot be conceptually explained by reference to an unambiguous rule formulation, I still experience that continuation as correct, right, or even necessary. Moreover, this acknowledgement, guided by a feeling rather than by a conceptual rule formulation, is an indispensable aspect of my understanding of the overture. It is indispensable, despite the fact that if another person asks me for a justification of my judgment, my response may not be any stronger than a gesture accompanied by this feeble, of course. So why is it that this Mozart remark, written on March 30, 1947, has ended up in Culture and Value, and thereby assigned a character of a general aphorism without much philosophical significance? The question becomes even more pressing when taken together with the fact that another remark, which I'm going to call Chopin, the Chopin remark, immediately preceding the Mozart remark in manuscript 134 and written on the previous day, has found its home in the collection called, or the book called Zettel. After all, according to von Wright, Zettel, a work based on a collection of fragments Wittgenstein himself cut from the manuscripts and left in a box file, contains some of the best remarks ever written by Wittgenstein. This is what von Wright says, and could be read as a work complementing the philosophical investigations, potentially intended as a bridge between its first and second part. In Zettel, the Chopin remark figures in a discussion on the understanding of music in the broader context of Wittgenstein's reflection on the constitution of meaning. And the Chopin remark is here. The speaking of music. Do not forget that a poem, even though it's composed in the language of information, is not used in the language game of giving information. Mightn't we imagine a man who, never having had any acquaintance with music, comes to us and hears someone playing a reflective piece of Chopin and is convinced that this is a language and people may want to keep the meaning secret from him? There is a strongly musical element in verbal language. A sigh, the intonation of voice in question, in an announcement, in longing, all the innumerable gestures of intonation. So the fact that Wittgenstein placed this Chopin remark in the arrangement of remarks that became to known as Zettel, thus treating it as he treated the remarks on music in the Tractatus and in the investigations, shows that he himself took the remark to be of philosophical value. Moreover, I don't think there can be any doubt that in the context of manuscript 134, from which both Mozart and Chopin remarks are drawn, the Chopin remark belongs together with the Mozart remark. The two remarks equally contribute to the overall theme of aesthetic understanding as a model for non-discursive understanding of language, which I have argued to be the main motivation for Wittgenstein's repeated references to music. Finally, and this is my final paragraph, if we look at the remarks, the two remarks, the Mozart and Chopin remark, in the context of the manuscripts from which they are drawn, manuscript 134, and in light of the interpretation I have today defended, we can see that what to von Wright looked like isolated aphorisms emerging in the middle of a philosophical reflection integrally belong to that reflection. On March 19, we find Wittgenstein evoking the idea of a melody going through his head, thus echoing the essence of knowing the tune described in Philosophical Investigations 184. 2 days later, he launches a long discussion on aspect seeing, a theme undoubtedly belonging to the core concerns of his later philosophy, describing in detail the condition of the experience of seeing an aspect. A week later, on March 27, he characterizes that experience, the experience of seeing an aspect, as one of "now I know how to go on," reminiscent of the experience of the pupil in the Philosophical Investigations, knowing how to continue the mathematical series, and stresses that what is involved is neither a thought nor an interpretation. These ideas, familiar from Wittgenstein's later philosophy, are then followed by a remark on the importance of examples in philosophy, a remark on how the tempo of reading a sentence influences the possibility of understanding that sentence, only to culminate in the Chopin and Mozart remarks. What could be read as an intermediary conclusion of this train of thought, Wittgenstein then writes, "Language has several roots. It has many roots, not one." I have argued that these roots include both discursive and non-discursive elements, which is what Wittgenstein's references to music are meant to underscore. That's it. Thank you.